Yo, what is going on, everybody? It is your boy Sonny here, coming at you guys with another Neverwinter video. And before we jump into this, I want to say thank you to all the support recently. It's been amazing. So thank you to everybody who's new to the Sonny Army and everybody who's been rocking with me since day one. Appreciate y'all. But without further ado, let's just jump straight into the video. Now, I'm going to throw up on screen from a commenter on my Neverwinter Barbarian build. Shout out to Wolverine. I'm going to go with Wolverine. It's the closest thing I can get to it. He says, can you do a class tier of some sorts? Everybody talks about how unbalanced the classes are. Some OP, some useless. No one actually says which one, as a new player, would be good to know before I smack 200 hours into a character that will fall short in endgame. So, I will do my best. Now, I'm not sure what I'm going to title and thumbnail this, but I want to just let you guys know that every DPS class has the potential to do damage. That's the problem with making one of these videos. But I will give you guys my honest opinions about what I think as Neverwinter as a community wants from a DPS, right? So you can take that as you will. I've been playing over different mods and seeing, which classes were sought after, which classes kind of take a back seat, which classes have an easier time getting in dungeons. So with that kind of information, because there's no, in my opinion, one specific class that does the most damage. I know people will put numbers out there, but to me it comes down to, do you know your class? And that's why I say every class can do DPS, but at the same time, other classes have it easier time. So before we jump into breaking down the DPS classes, I want to talk about races and which race you should pick as well, because a lot of times people skip this. For DPS classes, there's a couple different choices in my opinion. Dragonborn, I'd say, is on the topper end spectrum, followed by, of course, Metallic. But that's just like nitpicking. But definitely Dragonborn. Half Orc, right, isn't a bad choice. And some case scenarios, also the, Tiefling. Tiefling also isn't a bad choice as well. So usually those are a couple that I would rock with. For DPS, I wouldn't go with a half elf. A halfling might be good for PvP more. I wouldn't go with a dwarf for a DPS. So, stay away from a couple of those classes. But so let's say we pick a Dragonborn, just for this example. Just a regular one. Now, there's a couple different classes of fighting in Neverwinter. There is the fighter right here, which is also a tank, so it also has a dual purpose role. Initially, in my opinion, it's a tank first, then a DPS class, but I'll still count it in this DPS groups. Next, we have the Barbarian, aka my favorite class. DPS first, tank second, right? Warlock, same thing, dual purpose, DPS / healer. Ranger only has a single purpose of just strictly DPS. Same thing with Wizard, strictly DPS. And we move on to the Cleric and Rogue, who also DPS and heals. Primary healer, secondary DPS, and then the Rogue is just a straight damage dealer. So there's only 3 straight damage dealers in Neverwinter. But I'm also going to include the other classes that have damage Paragon Paths in this video. But if you're just strictly talking about Rogue, Wizard, or Ranger as being the only DPS classes, then that's a whole nother video then. But we're going to include the other ones as well, and we're just going to go through them. Now, in terms of fighter DPS, okay, if you're on that, I want to make a Guardian fighter, DPS, good luck. That journey, in my opinion, is going to be a little bit rougher because there's a little bit more of a skill gap. There's definitely some disadvantages compared to just a raw DPS class that's primary. For a fighter, in my opinion, don't get me wrong, there's some good ones out there, but I feel like there's more majority of ones who run tank because they know they're not really sought after as DPS. And when you play Neverwinter, you realize people want certain classes as DPS, right? And we'll get into that a little bit later. But unfortunately, Guardian Fighter really doesn't make this list. There was one mod, where they were shined out because, every mod there seems to be that one class that sticks out. But other than that one mod, I'd say I don't really think that they were so much, top DPS kind of deal. In my own opinion, this is where things get a little tricky. because, you know, I really haven't used a Guardian Fighter or DPS, but just from my experience. So that's what this video is going to be going on, just from experience, more or less. Now, Barbarian, you already know. I'm not going to be biased here, though, right? Not going to be biased. I'm going to give you guys the straight, raw facts. Being a Barbarian isn't that easy neither, because, you know, I love it. Would I say other people should play? Absolutely. It's a fun class, right? You know, it has its pros, it has its cons, it has its ups, it has its downs, just like every class. It has its tank path as well, so you kind of get that dual purpose, just like the Guardian Fighter. That's another thing about the fighter, but we're just talking about DPS. That's why I'm not really talking about the other end spectrums. So in terms of DPS here, as you guys know, my Barbarian does, you know, I would say I do decent DPS, right? But for people ranking up, it's definitely going to take you a decent amount of gap to reach a certain level, in my opinion, for a Barbarian. Just because you have to work a little bit extra than the other classes to obtain certain things. You know, because we are a tank secondary, we lose out on some of the primary DPS. You know, we have to, you know, we have more utility and more defense companion slots, whereas those just straight offensive powerhouses have just, you know, more power offensive slots, which in return, you know, they can put more power, better companions, whereas compared to us, we are kind of more limited in that range. So in terms of Barbarian DPS, you can definitely find groups, but again, it's almost like, I would say it's definitely above fighter level, but it's not top tier in terms of, you know, what I say you would find more time spent, you know, say you spend 50 hours on a Barbarian, 50 hours on a fighter, right? We'll just take 50 hours, for example. You know, you play both. Every class we're going to run through, you play 50 hours on. And if you take a fighter and a Barbarian, you know, you'll definitely have a higher chance of finding a group with a Barbarian DPS than a fighter DPS, in my opinion. So we'll stand it with that. Moving on, next is the Warlock. Now, they also are a healer, so you also maybe want to consider that when picking, but you want to know about the DPS aspect. Warlocks have always been up and down, hit or miss. Again, they take a big skill gap in knowing how to play the class, because they're not just natural heavy hitters. So you have to know what you're doing with a Warlock. You have to know your rotation. So there's definitely a bigger skill gap involved with the Warlock. But surprisingly, you know, if you're looking to make one now, they're on the up and up a little bit. You know, they're really nice in the new IC dungeon. They're really nice in Tom now because, you know, it's just one boss. And if you get the right build, you know, you spend 50 hours, you get in the feel for the class. You know, that's the best thing I could say as well. Is like, just playing the class will also just give you more knowledge and more DPS on it, because you know what to do. So it's really hard. It's really hard making this video because, like I said, they all can do DPS. It's just which ones are the most sought after at this point, right? And in my opinion, I would say Warlocks and Barbarians are pretty close together. You know, you might be surprised sometimes. You might run into that Warlock where you're like, well, damn, he's doing crazy DPS. Or you might run into that Warlock where they're like, you know, the typical Warlock kind of deal. You know what I mean? Same thing with a Barbarian, though, right? You can make the assumption there's those good Barbarians who stand out, and then there's their Barbarians who, you know, that's why we don't invite Barbarians, right? So in terms of them two, in terms of that aspect, that's where they stand, in my opinion. They kind of almost stand close together, you know, one being higher than the other in certain instances. But I don't know. Moving on to the Ranger, right? We'll talk about him. Now, he's just a pure DPS class, so like I said, he's going to have that bonus in the terms of companion slots. So right off the jump, he has an advantage over the 3 other classes, because the other classes are also a dual support. So that's why they take a back seat. So I personally never mained a Ranger, but I know they could do insane DPS for a long time. You know, back in the day, whether you were trapping them, you know, they did take a little hit because of how overpowered the trapping and rooting was. But as far as I know, you know, Rangers weren't never at the end of the spectrum in terms of damage, right? Rangers are usually consistent, I want to say, for the most part. I don't really see too many, you know, like low DPS HRs, to put it like that, say now this is where, in my opinion, because it's just a strictly DPS class, I feel, in my opinion, the strictly DPS classes are going to be at the top of the spectrum, just because they're, for that specific reason, they're primary DPS classes, you know, so they get that little bit of boost of advantage. But let's talk about the Ranger. So if you spend 50 hours in the Rangers, you're probably going to find yourself better off, in my opinion, than the Barbarian, the Fighter, and the Warlock in terms of finding groups, because people want Rangers in Neverwinter. Specifically, they will call out for them. You know, that's what I want to make sure too, because when you're playing, you'll see people in groups will call out for specific classes as well anymore. So that's what I'm also taking into consideration with this video. Like, I don't ever see people calling out for a Fighter. I don't see people calling out for a Barb. You know, occasionally I see it called out for a Scourge Warlock now. That's why I say it's a little bit higher. But Ranger, you usually see being asked for, just because, you know, they have a good buff, which could give the whole group a defensive buff. So they have a nice, you know, aspect of that end, and they deal amazing damage on bosses and mobs. So it's almost like a win-win situation when you're in HR. You know, so this is definitely up there on the tier list in terms of should you make one. A Wizard. These guys, in my opinion, are the killers here on Neverwinter. You know, I've seen some pretty nasty Wizards. You know, I got a good Barb, but if people know it, if they're on the same level as I am when I say, like, Neverwinter wise, and they got their Control Wizard down packed, you know, I've seen some killers out there who just murk me no matter what I do, whether we're running Tom, Lam, you know, even sometimes if I can get to the mob quicker, you know, they could just hammer me away at the bosses. And, you know, some of them still got some speed, even though they can't run too as well. So I'm actually gonna make a, you know, I'm gonna go ahead and say I'm gonna put Control Wizards at the top of the list, right? That might definitely rub some people the wrong way, but you guys know, you're playing Neverwinter, you're seeing groups being posted, man. They're asking for Control Wizards. Literally, the one day they were only asking for Control Wizards for a Tom run, just because of how just damage dealing they are. And it's, I don't want to say it's easy, but literally, it's just getting, you know, the power, hitting the buttons as soon as they come back. You know, and using your at-wills or encounter powers, whatever you have to. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a little bit more nonchalant, I would say. So I'm going to go ahead. I don't want to... So like I said, you spend 50 hours into the Wizard, I feel you're definitely going to have the most chance of getting in a group. You know, just because Wizards are so sought after because of how good damage they do. Moving on to Clerics. Now, these guys are a little tricky because they just started creeping up. Last mod, they were a little bit of damage dealers. You know, like, they could get it, but they were just missing that one thing. Now they have that one thing that puts them over that hump. Because I've seen some clerics do some insane damage. Now, I'm not going to sit there and say now that's an easy route to go. Because that's almost taking the route where you have to be a certain item level in order to do that kind of damage compared to, you know, some of the other classes. Because when people think of a cleric, I think it's just kind of instilled already in their brain that that's a healer. You know, oh, a healer can't do damage, because usually in the game you don't really think that a healer could be a top DPS in certain situations. But I've seen some Tom instances where, you know, the Cleric's #1 on the leaderboard, higher than the Control Wizard, higher than the Barbs, higher than whatever else the case is. So the Cleric is really situational. I wouldn't say I make one necessarily for DPS because, you know, I don't think they're going to stay long as primary DPSs, just because of the fact is they were once primary healers, and, you know, they usually don't stay too consistently on top in terms of DPS every mod, because usually every mod there's always that one class that gets nerfed and there's one class that puts themselves on the top, you know. So I don't really see clerics being as strong next mod. So in terms of DPS purposes, I'd put this probably towards the bottom, but not to say that it can't do DPS, just longevity wise I don't see it being consistently #1 or in that top range even, to be honest. Next we have the Rogue. Now, the Rogue, in my opinion, has always been pretty consistent. You know, it had its moment where it was a little flatline, But if you know what you were doing, you still did damage error. Other than that, the Rogue has always been a consistently good DPS. It's always been asked for in dungeons because it has dual purposes. It can be a killer on mobs. It can be a killer on the bosses. The one mod with Shadow of Demise was killer. You know, and even to this day, you know, mod 18, they still do hell of amounts of damage. So I would put the Rogue up there with the C-Dub right beneath it. I would probably... Alright, I'll give you a tier list right now before we go ahead and wrap this video up because it's going on pretty long, but I just want to explain things the best of my ability because that was a really good question to me. That was a really good question that he asked. Hopefully this video helps, you know, maybe it did. If it didn't, hey, I tried, right? Your boy Sonny, that's the best thing I can do is just try and get some information out there to you guys. So, I'd put Control Wizards on number 1, Rogue number 2, Ranger number 3. Now, the bottom few get a little tricky, okay? Because I'm going to put the Cleric at the bottom, then the Fighter, and then the Barbarian and the Warlock kind of interchange, right? So take that as you will in terms of like a tier list, in terms of being able to find groups and run dungeons, because that's what you want to do, right? So that's why, you know, not to say... I can't stress this enough either. Not to say that every class can't do damage and find groups that, you know, you're number 1 on the leaderboard, because I don't want to say that's not possible. But at the same time, you know, it's a very hard cover. It's a very hard topic to cover as well because of that reason. But at the same time, you know, deep down, people know what classes do more damage in Neverwinter because they're just more favored. And in my opinion, you know, those 3 specifically damage dealing classes will always have an advantage over the dual purpose ones. So hopefully this helped, guys. I didn't expect this video to be this long, but hey, shit happens. And yeah, let me know down in the comments if this helps. Shout out to Wolverine again. You know, hey, one of your comments could be a next video as well. But anyway, appreciate all the support, guys. It has been your boy Sonny here, and as always, I will check you guys out in the next one. Peace out.